Brilliant. So I am Bethany Gaunt, and I have recently joined the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre as Associate Director. As many of you will already know, the centre was established in memory of the late British historian. In addition to being the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, Sir Martin published 88 books on a wide range of topics, including influential and widely read accounts of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, and the history of the modern Jewish experience. He also published a series of pioneering historical atlases. Sir Martin was not only a master chronicler of the modern world, but also had a remarkable ability to bring history alive to his audiences. So fittingly, the centre's aim is to bring the finest historical research to a broad, non-academic public and to make history accessible and exciting for all. We offer a wide programme of events across the year on the subjects Sir Martin spent his life exploring. So I would encourage you to join our mailing list so that we can let you know about forthcoming events. The Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre is a charity, and we are grateful for any donations that you might want to make, however small. I'm really delighted to be introducing Tony Kushner this evening. He is a professor in the Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish, Non-Jewish Relations and History Department at the University of Southampton. He has written widely on the British Jewish experience, especially social history and comparative migration. Tonight's talk follows on from the research in Tony's last book, published in 2017, entitled Journeys from the Abyss, the Holocaust Enforced in Migration. Recently, he has published a popular history of migrant Southampton past and present, which incorporates a walking tour of the city. And if you would like to buy a copy, then please do email Tony. I'll post his email address in the chat. Tonight, Tony has prepared a brilliant talk for us entitled, When Did Migrants Become Illegal? Or Why Paddington Bear is the Perfect Antidote to Priti Patel, a title which is surely enough to whet anyone's appetite. This important topic is more relevant than ever today, and Tony will also be running a 4-week course on refugees past and present online for the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, beginning Friday the 1st of October, so please do consider signing up for that. I'll post a link to this seminar series in the group chat. Tony is going to speak tonight for approximately 45 minutes, after which we will open up the floor for questions and comments. You can post your questions in the chat throughout or message me directly, and we'll get through as many as possible after the talk. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over to Tony.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming this evening or this afternoon if you're elsewhere in the world. Before this talk, I did some extensive research. I did a Google count and looked at the phrase illegal immigrants, and it came up with 59,200,000 hits. And so that's today. I did a similar one in 2005, and it came up with 17 million hits. So this phrase, extraordinary numbers. And if you do variations on it of illegal immigrant, illegal immigration, the figure can get even higher. So enormous usage of the term. And I want to see, where did it come from? And how did it develop? And it's got a sort of longish history. And we're going to start in with the image to your right. I hope it's to your right, and it's me, as you probably recognise. Can everyone hear me? Yep, great. Okay. So, and next to a bear. When I was a Sheffield University student, the bear wasn't there, but a bear pit was, and it's an 18th century bear pit. And there's going to be a sort of bear theme in the first 5 minutes. And I want to start with in New York Harbor, and it's shortly after New Year's Day in 1890. and the story is taken from the New York Times and was headed Undesirable Immigrants. What is unusual is the type of immigrant involved. These were two performing bears, given the names Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel, and they had traveled with their 4 Italian owners and arrived in New York on board the Lake Huron, which we see on the left, via Piedmont, via Liverpool and Boston. The 4 owners, the 4 Italian owners, were not permitted, in the words of the New York Times, to become American citizens. And they escaped from the ship and disappeared in Boston, leaving the 2 bears behind. The collector, and this is an official title, at Boston refused the 2 bears permission to land. This then became the problem for his colleague in the port of New York. It's not clear whether the bears would be returned to Europe or landed as, and I quote, unclaimed merchandise and sold at auction. If we zoom forward to the 21st century, the slogan, "No one is illegal," has been taken up by pro-migrant groups, especially those campaigning on behalf of asylum seekers. It is used to highlight the common humanity of those placed beyond the law with regard to their national status. And in this respect, the children's character Paddington Bear, who came to England, as we will all know, hopefully, as a stowaway on board a ship from darkest Peru, has become I'm struggling with my PowerPoint here. Quite sure why it won't move. Just hold on a second. I will be back with you in 30 seconds because I don't want to lose the slides. Sorry about that. I will getting technical support from my youngest one. So Paddington Bear came from, as we know, as a stowaway, and has been called amongst immigration lawyers a walking, talking Ursine pinup for humanizing our work. And make no mistake, Paddington did not come into Britain through a regularized route, unlike his unfortunate forebears Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel in New York. Yet had Paddington, who arrived in London docks in the 1950s, come just half a century earlier, he would have had no need to enter as an illegal immigrant, because immigration controls in Britain were not invented until the 1905 Aliens Act. And although it was a very weak measure, it was the first permanent piece of immigration control in British history. I'm just going to, just a brief interlude if we can see if we can get the slides. Brilliant. Okay, migration is not a crime. So, 1905 Aliens Act. Before then, and this is something I think we find very difficult to understand today, until that point, 1905, you could move around into Britain freely, no controls whatsoever, no real things such as passports, visas, and so on. And the 1905 Act, although, as I say, a very weak measure, started that process. This evening, I want to start with Mandate Palestine and what was a key space and time in developing the concept of the illegal immigrant. So if you don't have immigration controls, you can't have an illegal immigrant because there's no such thing as illegality in this respect. Everyone can get in if they have the means to travel. Indeed, what was innovative during and immediately after the Nazi era was the type of location where the struggles over migrant restriction took place. It's been suggested by a political theorist of refugee movements, Matthew Gibney, that in the 21st century, the implementation of immigration controls has shifted in location. And he says, the traditional view of entrance as something operating at the state's borders, train stations and airports by domestic immigration officials increasingly appears quaint and outdated. It is now beyond the boundaries of the state on the high seas in foreign countries or in vaguely defined territories that exclusion from admission occurs. And it's in that context, I think we understand, relating to the title of tonight's talk, what Home Secretary Priti Patel is trying to do, sending desperate boat migrants to faraway places such as Ascension Island, which no one occupies, and very much along this sort of Australian model of what's been called remote control. So you don't stop people coming in at your borders, you move them to somewhere else. I will conclude this evening with an examination of the often catastrophic journeys that irregular migrants, including those that go across the Channel, are taking across the oceans today. But what Gibney calls new places of control, I would argue, can be identified much earlier. They were created and employed by the British Palestinian authorities throughout the Nazi era, and then immediately after it, when dealing first with Jewish refugees, and then the survivors of the Holocaust. Ironically, they were largely implemented in a locus now infamous for tragic migrant journeys, the Mediterranean. As will become apparent, those attacked can attempt to diminish the force of negative naming, such as illegal immigrant, by creating their own counter process. Judith Butler has worked on the damaging force of what she called hate speech, and her intervention, I think, is key here. But what Butler acknowledges is that to be named by another, whilst it's traumatic, she also emphasizes that trauma constitutes a strange kind of resource. It is an act that brings me into a linguistic world in which I might then begin to exercise agency, she says, leaving the future partially open. And I think this is to some extent true with the case of Jewish migration to mandate Palestine. Stalia Offer, who's written extensively on Jewish migration to Palestine this period, says that a variety of names were given to illegal aliyah to Palestine. It reflects its many facets. From the Zionist perspective, she says these included ha'apala, connoting something amounting up obstacles to reach the high ground, aliyah bet, Class B immigration, just designate an underground operation, Class A being that approved by the British authorities, and independent or special aliyah, terms used to emphasize the positive validity of Jewish immigration to Palestine. Others challenged official discourse by referring to so-called illegal immigration. Yet for those Jews attempting to reach Palestine during and after the Nazi era, the balance of forces has to be kept in mind. As Offer concludes, there is one final term to describe potential migrants to Palestine: illegal immigration, which of course was the preferred British designation. So looking at the 1930s, the attempt of Jewish refugees to reach Palestine by sea before September 39 is a story, when compounded with those who tried to enter during and after the Second World War, has gained mythical importance in the state of Israel and across the Jewish diaspora. The narrative constructed empowers agency and heroism upon those that both undertook and organized these emotionally driven and increasingly desperate life-saving journeys. Inevitably also casts those that oppose them, whether the local Arab population or the British mandatory government, as the villains of the piece. And there's little space left for ambiguity. Reality, however, is that the Jewish movement to Palestine in the 30s was complicated by the origins of the migrants, which is quite diverse, and the response of the British authorities and local population to them. And as early as 1933, the politics of naming that migration was itself becoming a site of contestation. In 1920, as part of its new mandatory powers bestowed upon it by the San Remo Conference, the British authorities instituted the first immigration ordinance for Palestine. Modelled on earlier alien legislation in Britain, as I've already mentioned very briefly, the 1905 Aliens Act, and then there were subsequent ones in 1919, which were much more severe, and also American early attempts at control. This immigration ordinance, it confirms Butler's analysis that with naming this, the repetition of its use gives it force. And what this ordinance of 1920 did was prohibit the entry of categories which are totally subjective. They included the entry of so-called lunatics, those rejected on medical grounds, and criminals. It was supplemented by a separate agreement that was made for those whose application was supported by the Zionist organization up to an agreed number. So this is very different, say, entry into Britain. This is a different dynamic. And reveals a sort of much more positive British reaction to Jewish immigration to the area in the early 20s. And these people, supported by the Zionist organization, would receive visas from British consular offices throughout the world. For these Jewish immigrants, possession of capital or the prospect of employment was the key to the numbers to be let in. And in some ways, there was a parallel there to getting into Britain in the 20s. If you had a large amount of money or special skills, you could be exempt from the controls. But also the Zionist organization, later the Jewish Agency, was responsible for the maintenance of those it had approved. The hope was that those coming into Palestine would be productive immigrants in what was in fact part of the British Empire. The needs of the country, as defined by the British authorities, was paramount in determining who would be allowed entry. In 1934, for example, Arthur Wauchope, the High Commissioner for Palestine, was asked by the leader of the Jewish Agency for fresh permits to be granted. Wauchope responded, "By what ways could you make me feel assured that these will be the type of labour we want most, at the same time most likely to be permanently absorbed?" So it's a sort of relatively open policy, but within restraints of usefulness. So it's not a refugee policy as such, it's an immigration policy. The 1920 immigration ordinance was produced in a moment of optimism by the British authorities. As the interwar period progressed, conflicting forces, local labour needs, Arab responses, world Jewish opinion, and the Jewish need for opportunities or asylum, they increasingly reveal the fragility of the situation. A managed immigration policy at the will of volatile economic and political considerations was bound to be messy, inconsistent, and subject to rapid change. With Arab unease about the levels of Jewish immigration to Palestine continuing to grow in the early 1930s, an attempt was made in November 1933 to tighten up procedures, especially for those without permits to work. Even so, the number of people affected was small. And revealing at that point the terminology to describe those whose paperwork was not in order remained uncertain, but naming of them was becoming a source of contention. In late 1933, the High Commissioner for Palestine emphasized how few were being affected. They also used, the British authorities used a variety of terms to describe those who were being pursued, including illegitimate immigrants, illegal settlers, and people engaged in illicit settlement. There was also some use of the phrase illegal immigrants, but this tended to focus, I quote, on individuals illegally crossing the frontier and on tourists entering the country and remaining illegally there. British Zionist leader Selig Brudetsky preferred the term unauthorized settlement. Nevertheless, the rhetorical device of linking illegality to immigration for the very first time in the world had been established. With increased Jewish migration to Palestine from Germany, but also from Eastern Europe and Iraq, and growing animosity from Palestinian Arabs, usage of the term would intensify and develop, and I think this is very significant, an increasingly conspiratorial tone. The words illegal and immigrant were now contiguous. By 1935, Jewish immigration to Palestine was again causing concern, and Jewish illegal immigration had become bureaucratically standardized with capitalization of the J, the I, and the I to ensure the firmness and certainty of this new label. It was now regarded as organized traffic rather than the spontaneous movement of individuals. Detention pending deportation is used as deterrence. So this is all becoming slightly more familiar in terms of roll on another 70 years. By the middle to late 1930s, attempts were being made by Zionist bodies to organize Jewish immigration to Palestine outside the British quota system. Yet rather than ad hoc responses to the increasingly marginality of Jews in Eastern and Central Europe, Colonial Office officials were convinced that there's something more sinister relating to the power rather than the powerlessness of the Jewish world. In summer 1939, the Colonial Office produced an extensive departmental paper on, again, with capitals, illegal Jewish immigration. It then became eventually a department in itself. It was prompted to do so by hostile press coverage, especially in America, of the Palestinian authorities and its treatment of those trying to reach its shore by boat, and more generally in relation to the British government's notorious 1939 white paper, which set a maximum of 75,000 Jewish immigrants over the next 5 years. Sorry, this is the least exciting slide you will see this evening. The Colonial Office was deeply concerned that the British government's perspective was being derided as inhumane by the outside world. To counter it, the Colonial Office emphasised that an intensive campaign of attempted illegal immigration into Palestine is now underway. These people, it said, are knowingly trying to evade the law of Palestine. The 1939 Colonial Office paper, propaganda paper, set the template for what would be an even more intensive performative struggle over the rights and wrongs of immigration policy in Palestine during the war and after. Like many defending immigration controls, emphasis was placed on, quote, the interests of the inhabitants as against the entry of myriads of immigrants who would, unless stopped, I quote again, flood the country indiscriminately through mass invasion. Control of illegal immigration was especially necessary in Palestine, it said, which was only about the size of a small county in New York State. Against this reality, it said, the idea is fostered by Jewish circles that they are justified in trying to break the law by virtue of some super-legal higher morality. So this is a battle about morality and appearing to be the bad guys or the good guys. Jews, at the Colonial Office argued, did this by citing the persecutions in Greater Germany and the desperate plight in which many European Jews now find themselves. But playing into a Semitic or anti-Semitic discourse of Jewish selfishness, criminality, and insularity, the Colonial Office paper highlighted how Jews were thinking only of themselves and failed to realize that what they are doing is fundamentally antisocial. Continued that it was in fact as antisocial as the German persecution of which they can complain. Indeed, it was argued the Colonial Office necessary to be clear about one thing: this illegal immigration traffic is a dirty, sordid, crooked business. Now that could come straight out of the Daily Mail over the last few years. To act as a deterrent and to diffuse tension in Palestine, the Colonial Office also explored the possibility of implementing a policy of disposal of illegal immigrants. The Secretary of State mooted the idea of finding an island or other suitable places where they could be maintained temporarily, pending their absorption as refugee settlers elsewhere. And eventually, Cyprus was to fill this role, but other places, as we'll see very shortly, as well. To give some raw statistics, in 1938 and 39, some 40,000 Jews reached Palestine, just over 17,000 of whom were categorized by the British as, inverted commas, illegal. So moving now to the Second World War. The outbreak of war and the fast deteriorating situation of European Jewry, the discourse of the Colonial Office on illegal immigration remarkably not only persisted, but intensified in its animosity. Indeed, the conflict allowed even more conspiratorial aspects to develop. The belief that the Nazis were encouraging such migration to cause maximum damage and embarrassment to the British in the Arab world was given fresh impetus. It was thus suggested that there were Nazi agents amongst the Jewish migrants who were now not only illegal, but also, quote, enemy aliens and fifth columnists. Increasing emphasis was placed on deterrence, but rather than detention in Palestine, officials believed that using other territories, especially within the British Empire, could now be employed. The more unattractive, the better. The infamous cases of the Patria and the Struma reflect how the impulse behind this option could tragically be put into practice. Although in the first few months of the war, there was a flurry of illegal immigration to Palestine, it slowed down by summer 1940, but picked up again in the autumn. Inevitably, the journeys on increasingly unsafe vessels in time of total war became more and more dangerous and the conditions appalling. Two such ships, the Milos and the Pacific, arrived early in 1940, carrying 1,800 Jews from Greater Germany between them. Sticking to the deterrent punishment plan, the decision was made to transfer them to the Isle of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean on a larger vessel, the Patria. The third disabled ship, the Atlantic, in which 7 of its passengers had died of typhus, was towed by the British Navy into Cyprus. And from there, under British naval escort, it set off for Haifa. On arrival, transfer of its passengers to the Patria began, but was largely incomplete before disaster struck. Some in the Haganah wanted a decisive response. On the 25th of November 1940, a bomb that had been planted earlier was detonated with the intention of immobilizing the Patria. The planned explosion led to calamity. The ship sank rapidly. Roughly 200 immigrants out of the 1,900 on board and 50 British crew drowned. After the explosion, the British cabinet decided not to deport the survivors of the ship to Mauritius, justified as a special act of clemency. This was not, however, a recognition of their persecution in Europe, but having regard to the sufferings which these immigrants had undergone in the SS Patria, as I said. This clemency did not extend to the passengers on board the Atlantic who would avoid being transferred. Instead, they were deported to Mauritius for the remainder of the war. One fears that Priti Patel might look at these files and get some ideas. The ending of Nazi emigration policy towards the Jews in autumn 1941 and the move towards the final solution along restricted routes of escape inevitably limited the number of Jews able to reach the shores of Palestine. Cases of the Salvador and the Struma reflected this harsh reality for European Jewry. The Salvador carried around 350 Jews, mainly from Bulgaria, and set off from Varna in December 1940. Unseaworthy, it was wrecked not long into its journey, with 200 passengers drowned, 70 children amongst them. The head of the Foreign Office Refugee section, in response to news of its sinking, noted, again, this is quite remarkable, there could have been no more opportune disaster from the point of view of stopping this traffic. Deterrence was still the main strategy of control. A month later, the Foreign Office heard reports that another ship carrying illegal immigrants was due to leave Varna. In a telegram to its representative in Sofia, it noted that the SS Struma is due to leave with 500 Jews for Palestine. Blaming the Bulgarian authorities for the terrible loss of life on the Salvador, it recommended that if the Struma is overcrowded and has insufficient life-saving apparatus, it should refer Bulgarians to relevant articles of international convention for the safety of life at sea. A year later, the same ship, in reality a converted yacht, embarked on a fresh journey that was to end in an even greater tragedy at sea. It left Constanza in December 41 with close to 800 Jewish refugees on board, victims of rapidly escalating Romanian state persecution. When it arrived in Turkish waters, the head of the Foreign Office Refugee Department, Randall, perceived a terrible dilemma. He said, if the Turks send the refugees back to the Black Sea, they may be wrecked, or in any case will presumably go back to the very hard conditions in whichever part of German-controlled Europe they have come from. If, however, they are sent onto Palestine, they will be an impossible burden for the High Commissioner. Randall added that refugees may also be a means of introducing enemy agents, argued that allowing them in would encourage further movements. This moves us then to the post-war era. The last journey of the President Warfield, renamed Exodus 1947, when it was transformed into one of the largest ships transporting so-called illegal immigrants to Palestine during the last years of the British Mandate, has become a central plank in constructing the mythological origins of the State of Israel. In the words of the Israeli novelist Yoram Kaniuk, after Exodus came the War of Independence. The first chapter ended and a new chapter began. At a mundane level, the ship was one of just many, over 60, carrying illegal immigrants attempting to reach Palestine from the end of the war to May 1948. Slow to pick up after the war, it was part of a rapid increase. In 1946, 23,000 Jews came to Palestine this way. In 1947, 29,000. And it's been estimated between 46 and 48, over half those that came to Palestine as clandestine immigrants came in those 2 years. It's been said, and this sort of shows the wider sort of reading of the ship's significance, that over 100 ships reached the shore of Palestine during these years of organized clandestine immigration, but none was as famous as the Exodus 1947. It exemplified the struggle of the immigrants and the shove for free immigration. The President Warfield Exodus 1947, having left France in July 1947 with over 4,500 Jews on board, was confronted by the British Navy as it moved towards Palestine, leaving 3 dead and the ship damaged. It was then escorted to Haifa under British control. At Haifa, most of those on board were transferred by the British to 3 ships, the Runnymede Park, Ocean Vigor, and Empire Rival, and then returned infamously to Europe. After an extended stay in Port de Boc, where the vast majority of the refugees refused to accept the French offer of asylum, the ship moved on to Hamburg, where they arrived in September 47. Following a minor struggle, 4,000 Jews on board disembarked. Sent to the two refugee camps, the Exodus 1947 refugees were given privileged status by the Zionist movement and were surreptitiously sent to Palestine as special immigrants. Such a performative act was in final defiance of the British authorities over this notorious episode. There are many such confrontations between the British authorities and illegal Jewish immigrants in the immediate post-war period. The island of Cyprus, as I mentioned, became a holding camp for thousands. Yet both at the time and subsequently, the journey of Exodus 1947 was given special attention. Ambassador Duff Cooper in Paris told the French foreign minister that the British government intended to make an example of this ship. But for the Zionists, it was, according to the journalist Ruth Gruber, one of its most famous chroniclers, the ship that launched a nation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Leon Uris's best-selling book and later film of Exodus revealed a deep American identification of this journey. They paved the way for later memorialization in America in nation's heritage sites, including the Smithsonian. And in Israel, not surprisingly, identification with Exodus 1947 has been even more intense. With the need to emphasize Jewish agency in the formation of the state, the organization of illegal immigration played and continues to play a key role in Israel mythology as a foundation story of the nation, of Jewish agency. Thus has been contested by rival Zionist factions, as well as the leaders of the ships, anxious that their role in the epic story was not lost or marginalized. On board the ship, the passengers confronted their naming as illegal by asserting their own identity and agency. The leaders told them, "You are already citizens of Eretz Israel, whatever the English say." And they were presented with blue certificates printed in Hebrew on one side and English on the other, entitled "A Permit to Enter Palestine." It's been said that when the story of illegal immigration was put down in the first decades of the Jewish state, the immigrants themselves disappeared. It was very much a top-down approach, and it was apparent even on board the ship itself. Several days after its initial departure from France, Haganah organizers in France agreed that it was to be known as Exodus 1947. The commander of the ship, Yossi Harel, was informed of this decision. This dramatic renaming was not communicated to the passengers, who had come up with alternatives. The American crew members were keen on Roosevelt, perhaps of Eleanor rather than Franklin. Some passengers preferred Mordechai Anilowitz, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. So very different politics involved there. These were ignored, but it was not until the ship came into conflict with the British Navy that the new name was unveiled, and it sailed into Haifa with a large banner at her center declaring that she was Haganah ship Exodus 1947. Thereafter, so great was the aura associated with this journey that all three ships returning to Europe became known as Exodus 1947, despite their different names. And it added to the ship's mythology. Indeed, the issue of naming was such that the British government was forced in vain to insist on the original naming of the ship, especially the President Warfield. Subsequent memory, the specifics of the particular journeys of the four ships collectively known as Exodus 1947 would matter less. And if you going back to Leon Uris, his loose grasp of history, and his melding and confusing of names was only the most blatant and influential example of this process. It's not therefore surprising that the President Warfield itself was left to rot in Haifa, where it remained abandoned and was accidentally set on fire in 1952, disappearing beneath the waves, it was said, like so much discarded rubbish. Now rests on the seaboard outside the port. Nevertheless, its journey and that of the other 60 so-called illegal Haganah ships feature prominently in the clandestine immigration and naval museum in Haifa. Historians now dispute the centrality of illegal immigration in the power politics of late Mandate Palestine and the eventual formation of a Jewish state. Yet at the level of popular mythology in Israel and the wider Jewish diaspora, these journeys, and especially that of Exodus 1947, still play a self-affirming and comforting role. There is thus an attempt at continuity in stressing Jewish self-determination in the clandestine immigration and naval museum, with Haganah-led ships of 1946 and 7, melding into that of the Israeli Navy. In addition, part of the Patria I mentioned earlier has subsequently been salvaged and is on display there, again used performatively as a symbol of Jewish self-determination and outside indifference to the Jewish plight. In the dominant Israeli narrative, Jewish isolation during the Holocaust and the antipathy towards its survivors, as typified by the treatment of illegal immigrants by the British authority, largely precludes consideration of other migrant journeys, particularly of the Palestinians in 1947 and 48. And it's perhaps not surprising that that is the case, given the politics of the Middle East. Though it may not necessarily be the case in the future if we want to move towards a sort of shared narrative of mutual understanding. But if making such linkages, however desirable, seems unlikely, given the dismal politics of the contemporary Middle East, is it equally hard to envisage the Exodus 1947 story being placed alongside more recent narratives of forced migration across the Merciless Sea? So far, there's been very few comparisons, but I want to finish this talk by trying to do so. And I want to focus on the island of Lampedusa, which is in its way famous in the Jewish world in a different way for the very successful Yiddish play, The King of Lampedusa, which coincidentally recently reproduced in the Parks Institute. But this is a very different Lampedusa. I'm going to refer to the same island, a different story. It's been estimated that from 1933 to 48, over 100,000 Jewish illegal immigrants came to Palestine in 116 vessels. In 2014 alone, double that number of undocumented migrants came to Europe by sea, thousands drowning in the Mediterranean, attempting to do so. In 2015, those numbers were quadrupled. In her Human Cargo on 21st century migrants, Caroline Moorhead defines an illegal immigrant as a person residing in a foreign country without permission. As the narrative progresses, Moorhead returns to that definition. She interrogates it, especially in relation to the Australian homeland of her father, Alan. Again, this is a connection here to another Jewish story. Moorhead was one of the famous people who went into Nelson and described it to a British and world audience. But Australian means a lot meant a lot to Alan, and it meant a lot to his daughter. In Australia, boat people, regardless of their status, were labelled by the Liberal government during the 1980s as, inverted commas, illegals. For Moorhead, the use of the word illegal suggests criminals, people have done wrong, terrorists, certainly people not entitled to anything. They're seen as queue jumpers, stealing the places of the good refugees who have been patiently waiting their turn. Moorhead's Human Cargo was an important intervention into debates about world asylum seekers, which had grown increasingly animated in the early 21st century. By the time of her book's publication in 2005, the island of Lampedusa had become infamous in this respect, and notoriety that has grown exponentially in the subsequent decade. This is one of the sort of classic photographs from above of a migrant ship, or boat, more accurately, heading towards or just near Lampedusa. Lampedusa, as Moorhead poetically suggests, is where Italy ends and where Africa begins. It is a small, sparsely populated and bare island, much closer, as we can see, to North Africa than to Italy. Ominously, with regard to its later function as a reception then detention camp for migrants in the late 20th and early 21st century, it had a prehistory, serving as a penal colony during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Just if you go to Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town, it has had many functions of keeping those regarded as unclean and undesirable. Moorhead described Lampedusa in the first years of the new century. Spring and summer, on the long calm days, it is where the refugees arrive almost daily in their battered and crumbling boats, frightened, unsure, expectant. More clinically, she added that experts in asylum matters who study the flow of refugees and their journeys to the north call it the blue route after the waters of the Mediterranean. Since then, no place has come to symbolize the intense human tragedy and drama of modern migration, evoking sentiments of pity, shame, and fear in equal measures, and no more so than in very recent years. The last couple of years, politicians, NGOs, the media, and the islanders and migrants themselves have confronted and represented the recent and ongoing story of Lampedusa. And as with Palestine and illegal, inverted commas, immigration, questions of performativity have been central in establishing meaning at Lampedusa. In 2015, TripAdvisor produced a list of the top 10 beaches in Europe. The first three were in the Mediterranean, with Rabbit Beach, Lampedusa ranked the highest. This is a photograph I took, which just shows the tough things you have to do as a researcher. Here I was in the middle of summer, and this is one vision of Lampedusa, of the most beautiful beach, bizarre sort of lunar style landscape, and a place for tourists to go, and particularly quite well-off Italians. As is happening in other parts of the Blue Route, including more recently the Greek islands, the misery of migration at its most desperate is coinciding in time and place with the pursuit of tourist pleasure. Affluent Western visitors are thus witnessing the victims of dictatorship, failed states, civil war, ethnic cleansing, religious intolerance, and basic deprival of life chances. They are thus inadvertently becoming co-presents to those suffering the most extreme problems of this century. There are no definitive figures for those who have died migrating to Europe, using the Mediterranean. Using media and NGOs, the monitoring group Fortress Europe argued that between 1993 and 2011, close to 20,000 died en route. Since then, the numbers have gone up alarmingly and continue to do so, well, until very recently. Due to stringent control in North Africa, the numbers using the Mediterranean route have declined, but relatively the death rate has intensified as journeys become ever more desperate and exploitative. Even now, many disappear without trace. The problem of using existing data in portage is that some places receive more attention than others because they've developed into what's been called border theatres. Of all of these, Lampedusa is one of the most prominent examples. Without its connection to boat migrants, it's been said Lampedusa would just be one of those many minor Italian islands living on fishing and tourism. Its recent connection to migration began slowly and then transformed the island. At times this century, migrants have outnumbered residents, just 5,000 residents, and an infrastructure involving large-scale policing and humanitarian presence has also impacted on its everyday life. It's often assumed that desperate migrants have chosen to come to Lampedusa as the closest piece of European land from Africa. Whilst it may have been true some in the 1990s, it's not been the case subsequently. Since the early 21st century, it's been emphasized that migrants did not arrive of their own accord. They did not choose Lampedusa, but were directed and diverted there by the Italian authorities as a way of controlling the flows of migration, which are both increasing in numbers and diversifying in places of origin. So it's again this idea of remote control on an island. In 2013, close to 15,000 migrants were processed through Lampedusa, most fleeing from Eritrea. In the 1990s, numbers were smaller, but they merited a construction of an informal reception centre, largely run by local volunteers. 2 years later, reflecting the growing anxiety about such migration, this voluntary centre was replaced by an official one near the airport, accommodating up to 150 people and surrounded by barbed wire. And the inmates were forbidden from moving around freely. And from there, they were then distributed to Sicily or mainland Italy or deported to Libya. In turn, a new detention centre was constructed, which opened in 2017, designed for up to 800 internees. And here again, we see a sort of migrant resistance in form of attempt to burn down the reception centre. Lampedusa has become a border zone, a place which had essentially become detached from the rest of Italy. It's a sort of stateless place. And it became, the Sicilian Channel had in fact become an outer border of the European Union. So Lampedusa becomes a sort of place or non-place where attempts were made at controlling the flow of unwanted illegal immigrants. Then on the 3rd of October 2013, the world, and that's a quote, witnessed the most dramatic human disaster in the Mediterranean since the Second World War. A small fishing boat had left Libya carrying over 500 largely Somalian and Eritrean refugees caught fire half a mile from Lampedusa. Only 155 survived, the rest drowning. What happened on the 3rd of October was far from the first instance of migrant mass death at sea, but it's been surpassed by even greater tragedies thereafter. Response to it, however, 2013 disaster marked a rupture. Its scale was too great for us to ignore. The disaster led to an international outcry led by the new Pope, who visited, at his first visit, the island where both survivors and the bodies of some of the dead had been brought. Pope Francis responded that, and I think very much with a sort of Holocaust discourse in mind, the word disgrace comes to mind. It is a disgrace. He also urged, let's unite our efforts so that tragedies like this don't happen again. Whilst in 2014, through a variety of governmental and private initiatives, some 170,000 migrants were rescued in the Mediterranean. Less than 18 months after the October disaster, several similar boats capsized close to Lampedusa, with over 300 deaths. These, however, were overshadowed by an even larger catastrophe in the spring of 2015. May of that year, a boat carrying over 800 migrants sank, leaving just 28 survivors. And attempts have been made, some successful, to sort of identify those people so that then they can at least be given names and burials. Up to 500,000 migrants attempted this dangerous journey by land and then sea from Africa to Europe in 2015 alone. And whilst the numbers have decreased, boat migrants have decreased since then, the deaths at sea has grown more recently. There's a parallel in Lampedusa to the Exodus 1947, when the British and Palestinian authorities wanted to make a salutary example, as well as a specific case of refused entry to illegal immigrants. In both cases, security and economic fears have run alongside humanitarian concern. In the case of the Jewish illegal immigration, the British tried and failed to impress the world that those embarking on such journeys, especially the organisers, were doing so at the expense of genuine, legitimate refugees. Today, similar dynamics are at work, with the focus of European bodies and politicians being on the criminal smugglers and the need to curtail their activities, including the destruction of boats used to carry the migrants. And similar attempts were made by the British in 1946 and 47. Those that used to transport Jewish migrants were larger vessels, well beyond their useful life. Many of those today are tiny. As someone said, they're like the things that children used to play with on the beach. They really are just toys. It's been noted that of the 50,000 migrant deaths in transit recorded, and perhaps as many as 2/3 are not. So that would take it up to 150,000. For as many as 1 in 5, the region, let alone the country of origin, is unknown. That so many deaths literally leave no trace in a world of instant communication and constant surveillance reflects the utter obscurity and marginality of so many migrants today. And those figures include 300 who have died trying to reach Britain by sea, train, or plane. The Mediterranean, for example, has been described as the busiest ocean in the world, yet thousands have drowned in it. Against that invisibility is the desire of many NGOs, journalists, campaigners, academics, and others to restore individuality to the migrants. Yet EU regulations force migrants into certain narratives in order to gain asylum. Perhaps the most desperate attempt to perform refugeedom is the desire to show innocence through the presence of young children on these boats. And we think of the reaction to the photographs of Alan Kurdi, the three-year-old washed up on Turkish shore. Again, that evocation of children as innocence. Abdul Azizi and 26 other refugees from Afghanistan and Syria boarded a boat from Turkey aiming for Greece. After 2 hours, their engine failed and a Greek Coast Guard vessel ordered them to return to Turkey. Abdul says, "We said the boat had broken down. We took the babies and held them above our heads to show that these were children, that there were children on board. But they didn't listen. Their boat was towed towards Turkey and then began to sink. He said the women and children were in the hold and we went to try and get them. Everything happened so quickly. There was no time to save our children. We had arrived in Europe. We were refugees. But in a flash, I had lost my child and my wife." In 1947, I think there's a parallel here, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust on one of the clandestine boats tried to perform, according to a very cynical British intelligence officer, a Belsen pose, whatever that meant. And again, he was sort of denying that they were at all innocent and deserving. In the 21st century, the climate of distrust is such that migrants are forced to exhibit their children to show that they're not a threat to the receiving countries. In the detention centres of the island in its everyday life, the migrants have both resisted and formed alliances with the local inhabitants. And again, I think we need to look at resistance and not just the passivity of migrants. In February 2014, this led to the creation of a remarkable document, the Charter of Lampedusa, which was not intended as a draft law, but as they put it, an alternative, that was from the first disaster when the Pope came to visit. So this is the Charter of Lampedusa, an alternative vision where it says differences must be considered as assets, a source of new opportunities, and must never be exploited to build barriers. We seem to be building ever more of these by the day. Lampedusa has also acted as a source of identity for those who have found asylum beyond its shores. It has led to groups including Lampedusa in Berlin, Lampedusa in Hamburg, and so on, using the solidarity of this experience to campaign for better treatment of migrants at all stages of the journey. Those migrants who have passed through the island have made a determined effort at self-representation, including in the form of heritage performance. An alternative museum, Lampedusa, has been created on the island itself. I think there's a sort of nice link there to the clandestine immigration museum in Haifa. And they've created their own sort of films and documentation as well. I think one of the nice things I like at the clandestine immigration museum is that they have hundreds of fake passports. So they're performing the illegality of their documentation, but in a context where this is regarded as morally right rather than as a criminal act. Exodus 1947 was performed both at the time and subsequently as an epic narrative. It is already clear that Lampedusa has become part of a global story, one in which the migrants themselves are playing a significant role in constructing its present and future memory. So to pull this together, in conclusion, the island of Lampedusa has been a military base for various empires, and it's continued this fortress role as a border for the European Union. It's also been a place of local welcome to newcomers escaping danger, and a place of livelihood for fishermen and farmers. Population movements in and out of the island, forced and voluntary, are integral to its remote history, a part of, not apart from Europe. Boat people and the treatment of them, including deportation and return, as well as empathy towards them, are part of a deep history and not alien to it. In the politics of performativity involving both Exodus 1947 and contemporary boat people, history matters. On one level, they share a common bureaucratic past, which I've outlined, and the construction of this relatively new term, the illegal immigrants. I would argue that exclusive readings of the past hinder the universalism proclaimed in the Charter of Lampedusa, that, and I quote, as human beings, we all inhabit the earth as a shared space, stands for global freedom for all, recognizing that the history of humanity is a history of migration, admonishing no illegalization of people. Migration is not a crime. But there is more. During the world of Trump and its aftermath and Brexit, it became normalized for migrant children to be incarcerated and even to die in captivity, and for those legally settled in Britain for decades to lose their jobs, housing, and to dying through refusal of medical treatment and to be deported, the result of what was initially Theresa May's initiative to create a hostile environment towards so-called illegal immigrants. With bitter irony, in 2019, Britain agreed to create a national memorial to the Windrush generation on the same day that protests were being carried out against the continued deportation of those who came from the Caribbean in the post-war period. The illegal alien or the illegal immigrant has always been a cultural construct that has been imposed by politicians and civil servants to keep out those they do not want, often for reasons of racism, including anti-Semitism. In America, the slogan, what part of illegal don't you understand, has become everyday discourse. Once a people become illegal, as Jewish history shows us, anything is possible. I want to close with the late Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor, humanitarian and Nobel Prize winner, Elie Wiesel, reflecting on America's treatment of migrants at its borders, a crisis that has certainly not gone away. And Wiesel said, "You who are so-called illegal aliens must know that no human being is illegal, that it is a contradiction in terms. Human beings can be beautiful or more beautiful. They can be fat or skinny. They can be right or wrong, but illegal. how can a human being be illegal? So finally, to reappropriate Martin Luther King's words at Alabama, how long have migrants been labeled illegal? The answer is historically, not too long, but ethically, far, far too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tony. That was, you've given us so much to think about. It was absolutely fascinating. And you really gave us that historical perspective. I found it pretty harrowing to think of all those people who've lost their lives just trying to seek asylum and a safe place to live, and the children as well, as you mentioned, that are used as a sort of poster for that. I also want to say apologies for muting you accidentally at the start of your talk. I did not mean to do that, but I'm glad you recovered quickly. To everyone, we do have time for some questions now, just a couple probably, but so feel free to pop them into the chat. And I wondered, Tony, if it's okay, could I ask you a question first? That's the hostess's prerogative. I wondered, thinking about how you started with the 1905 Aliens Act, I wondered what was it that led to that being created, that legislation? Was there a single event?
That's a really good question, and there isn't a sort of easy answer, and that you can't say, right, there's this huge number of people that came on this, and then the next year you have legislation. It's a sort of combination. I think to me the most persuasive answer is, why is it in the 1850s you get people like late 1840s, people like Karl Marx and other revolutionaries coming, and people don't like them, they don't treat them very well, but the idea that you could stop them coming, this was seen to be an essentially English thing. We showed how superior we were to the continent because we could let in these diseased radicals from the continent. And then 50 years later, that mood has changed. And I think it's not, yes, there's an increased number of aliens, as they were called then, most of them, not all of them, East European Jews. And you could say, well, it's cause and effect, but I think it's much more complicated, that it's a loss of confidence, but it's not a total loss of confidence. And on one level, Britain is, as the school books of that period would have shown, 1/3 of the landmass of the world would be pink and part of the British Empire. And so that, one level, it's imperial height, and Britain is still the workshop of the world, but things are starting to fall apart a bit. There's competition. Empire is starting to fight back. Boer War is a terrible shock to morale. These backward Boer farmers are giving Britain a roasting, and there is a sort of fin de siècle fear, but it's still contested, and I think that's why you end up, and we'll discuss this in much greater detail in the first couple of weeks of the course. It's still really contested, which is, and I think the net result is this rather feeble act, which is astonishing that it has, and again, it shows that it's not just superficial, this belief in the right of asylum, which is the first time nationally or internationally an attempt is made to define what it is to be a refugee. And it's liberals, Labour Party, Jewish campaigners and others who insist, if you're going to have this measure, you've got to exempt people who are refugees. Now, how do you prove you're a refugee? Initially, in the first year, you just say, I'm a refugee. And the immigration official, not many of them, there's only a certain amount of ports, have to shrug their shoulders, okay, take your word for it. Today, the proof of evidence has got to be so strong to prove that you're a genuine victim, fearing persecution. But it was the reverse then. Now that quickly dissipates, and by the First World War, that rather nervous way into immigration control has gone to something very draconian. So it only took a few years. So it's a rather apologetic thing. It doesn't apply to anyone traveling second class or first class. So you can be super criminal, full of diseases, traveling second class, and you're exempt. So it's full of holes. The Home Office regard it as a disaster. It's just unworkable. People are deported as a result of it. They are kept out of the country. So it's not without some impact, but it is a very sort of half-hearted measure, and it takes 2 years of discussion, and that says something. You know, it keeps getting bounced back and gets weaker and weaker. But it's significant symbolically, and I think that 2 years of discussion reflects how controversial it was, and it goes with other things, again, lack of confidence, ending of free trade. The two things go together. So I think it reflects this sort of worry of what is happening, the question of Britain. And I think that's almost always, you can say, what are the things that people worry about? And the way you can get a shorthand into that is, what do they connect to immigration? Because, you know, these problems aren't caused by immigration, but they're a sort of, if you like, a scapegoat, a shorthand. So, and that's true, I think, today as it was then. Sometimes very contradictory things. You know, there were defenders of the Jewish immigrants who said, actually, they're healthier, they work better, they'll assimilate very quickly. They're exactly the sort of people we want. But that self-confidence was being disputed. So I think it's significant because it breaks with the past. Yes, there have been emergency measures in the time of war, but the Home Office, when they're trying to get a model, they can't find one. You know, they're scrambling around in their very sort of dodgy archives in terms of how they're catalogued. They can't really find a workable model. So, you know, it's an indication of how radical in the way this move is.
Yeah. Thank you. I've had a message sent to me privately, which makes a very interesting point. They say, to immigrate doesn't explicitly mean one will then be allowed to integrate. So is it enough? If one immigrates and remains contained by the native society within a disadvantaged systemic ghetto, how truly noble is the receiving nation when it is extolling its own humanity, hospitality, and goodness?
Okay, that's a really, I think it's a very sensitive point that, and very valid, that, you know, that I think it says a lot about, particularly British. It's not alone. Britain's not alone as having this sort of strong belief in its difference, that, you know, we are more tolerant, we are more decent, fairer than any other country. I think it you know, goes back to sort of British values, that when people trying to define them, and Gordon Brown tried this after the London bombings, and you struggle because you come up with things that almost everyone would sign up, and that there's, someone, the sort of party trick, well, let's reverse those. Which country is going to stand up to say that, you know, I believe in unfairness, I believe in indecency? Well, I suppose you could say Trump's America, didn't come far off that, but it was where, you know, anything, the worse it was, the better. And there are touches of that about Johnson, but, you know, it doesn't matter how bad he is. People, you know, we love him, but most, you know, in turn, he wouldn't say what it is to be Britain is to be grossly unfair. He would still buy into this idea that was, but these are almost every Western nation would buy into those. But it doesn't make it, you know, I mean, again, the example of Marx, make it an extreme one, but people despised foreigners. And yet you get editorial after the editorial in the Times, sort of a high Tory opinion, mid-19th century, saying we must still allow refugees in. It's what makes us different, what makes us superior. And I think that two-ness can make it, on one level, it can create, I think, migrant opportunities on the edge to explore, on one, you know, crude level, sort of hypocrisies of Britishness, but on another, the intricacies of it. And I think it's no accident the people that explain Britishness best are outsiders. And I think that in the film world, the most wonderful example of that was Alexander Korda. So a Hungarian refugee who came into Britain, but in Austria, he was Hungarian Jew. In Austria, he made Austrian films. In Britain, he told the British what their history was in his most ludicrous films, Secret Lives of Henry VIII and so on. Then he went to America and invents Americanness and so on. And George Michael's How to Be an Alien, I think, is both one of the funniest but also perceptive books about what it is to be British. So, you know, but it's not something you necessarily wish on people, because it means that you're observing, you're astute, You can produce art and culture because you're on the margins. And that's not, and then if you want to see the flip side of that, and it is a difficult one, if you look at sort of migrant and particularly refugee rates of sort of mental health and suicide are enormously high. And we see that in the Black community today, of just enormous problems of mental health. And that because there's then a denial that there's a problem. Like the first, if there was acceptance that, yes, we have a problem with intolerance, not just intolerance, but there is intolerance and it exists. But if you're being told, no, actually, it must be you because we're very decent and tolerant. So it can be a very tricky thing to negotiate. But I suppose the side of it is that it does create a perceptiveness as well. When we look at the people, if we take literature, the people of migrant origin who have dominated English literature over the last 50 years and longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just looking at the time now. It's 8:15 almost, so I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. But before everyone leaves, just got a few important announcements. So thank you, of course, once again to Tony and to all of you for joining us this evening. And a reminder that Tony will be running a 4-week course on refugees past and present beginning next Friday, the 1st of October. And it will be an interactive course. There'll be readings for you to engage with before each session. And we'll be offering the course at the special price of £60. Spaces are limited, I should say, and so I'd encourage you to book onto that and secure your place as soon as possible. As I mentioned earlier, we are a small charity and we very gratefully receive any donations. It's very easy to donate on our website should you want to do so. I'll be sending out a short survey soon and would really appreciate your feedback to help us shape the future of our event. So please do take a minute or two to complete that. But thanks again for joining us, and thank you, Tony. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.